Well, thank you guys for being here today. Today's day one of our very wonderful audience here. Today's day one of our research presentations, and before they get going, they've done a lot of hard work this semester, and we appreciate all their efforts. I also want to thank you too. To give you a little background on the way our program is run, about 5 or 6 years ago, the Institute sort of came to an understanding that some students can't get off campus for internships. Some students didn't want the office experience, but really looking for more of a research opportunity. So we really created this program as an opportunity to sort of accommodate both needs. And of course, the pivotal key part of that is our partners. Without our outside partners, this program simply wouldn't take place. So on behalf of the Institute, we'd like to thank both Brendan and I for being here today and all your participation throughout the semester. So no further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our homeless policy research team. I will tell you just in terms of how this will roll out, their presentation is going to go for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll go into our Q&A portion, and we would hope you'll have plenty of questions, and I'm sure Nate and I and others will have questions for them, but it really is an opportunity to have a conversation with them specifically about what they discovered and what you know, and to make it a useful exercise. So with no further ado, our Research One Policy Group.
So first and foremost, I really want to thank you all for attending, and of course a special thanks to the Skid-Row Housing Trust and USC Homelessness Initiative. So today we are going to be our goal today is specifically working on discussing the strategies that we found based on various cases from different sectors and provide policy recommendations of how to best utilize best practices for capacity building with the issues of homelessness in Los Angeles. So to start, the issue that we're encountering is we have an influx of funds in an industry that is used to running on less. And the fact of the matter is, what can we use? What strategies can we implement to ensure that we use this money in the most effective way as possible? So the question that we're handling specifically is how can the homeless services industry in Los Angeles best use their increased funds to build their capacity efficiently? But before addressing the new legislation that has made the influx of funds possible, I think it's important to discuss the issue that's at hand. So, Los Angeles County has the second largest homelessness population in the United States, just behind New York, at approximately 58,000. But what's unfortunate is that it also is known to have the highest unsheltered population, with about 25%, only 25% of the homeless in Los Angeles County being sheltered. But the numbers are growing exponentially. Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority has reported that there was a 23% increase just from last year on the amount of homeless people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles County. And citizens and politicians alike both understand that this is a growing issue and have felt the need to address it in a very direct way. So I think that it's really important to discuss the new legislation that's at hand in regards to our research. So first is Proposition H, which was passed in November of 2016, widespread support in Los Angeles, in the city of Los Angeles specifically, with about 76% in support of the legislation. It is expected to generate $1.2 billion specifically allocated towards creating about 10,000 units of permanent housing over the next 10 years by increasing property taxes. And then the next piece of legislation is Measure H, which was passed in Los Angeles County in March of 2017. Now this is expected to generate about $355 million per year for the next 10 years, specifically towards the distribution of services in Los Angeles County. It will increase sales tax by about 1/4% for the next 10 years to generate that revenue. Now, the form that you see here is produced by the Los Angeles Board of Supervisors, specifically their Los Angeles County Homelessness Initiative. And in this report, they outlined 22 strategies that they were mainly focused on allocating these funds towards, such as creating a coordinated system, prevention of homelessness, and also case management as well. But the issue at hand that we're really discussing is capacity building. And what does that exactly entail? It's discussing the scale, the reach, the efficiency and effectiveness of programs and the ability for organizations to best reach their goals and missions. And it's about leveraging the resources that you have in order to produce the maximum effect in the communities that you're working towards assisting. But I really want to allow my colleague Rex to speak, specifically because he's going to be talking about an approach to capacity building on the structural level and giving us some insight on how to address, how to combat such a huge issue, such as the problems in LA, by looking at a case study in Iraq.
Well, thank you, Shernae, and good morning. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq and toppled the regime of Saddam Hussein. This precipitated rapid social and institutional collapse in the Middle Eastern state. And the United States tasked itself with rebuilding capacity in that failed state. So using the example of the Coalition Provisional Authority, or CPA, which acted as Iraq's governing body from 2003 to 2004, I will be examining optimal strategies for institutional capacity building in 3 key areas, including strategic planning, staffing, and interagency relationships and coordination. I believe an example of state building is particularly analogous to the provision of homeless services in LA for 2 key reasons. Firstly, because both state building operations and homeless services seek to provide services to individuals who often lack a basic sense of security or access to basic services. And for another, both case studies seek to build safer environments through humanitarian aid and assistance. I will ultimately conclude that the activities of the CPA in Iraq and of the administration generally can be seen as a failure from which Los Angeles may draw cautionary lessons. So let us begin with the importance of strategic planning and organizational structure to the capacity building process. In the case of Iraq, the Bush administration gave all strategic planning authority through National Security Presidential Directive 24 to the Defense Department. This move was seen as a way to streamline the planning process and reduce bureaucratic waste. However, its actual effect was to pass off all planning responsibility to a subordinate agency. This prevented the administration from acting as an integrated authority from which plans could be combined from across sectors. And the result was that the CPA, in its capacity as the governing body of Iraq, was deployed into Baghdad without a cohesive political military plan to address capacity issues in Iraq. Another key component of strategic planning is planning for contingencies or worst case scenarios. Now, I believe the Bush administration suffered from a case of over-optimism in its initial invasion of Iraq. It only committed 150,000 troops to Iraq initially, when estimates indicated that 250 to 400,000 would be needed for a successful regime change operation. Even after it became apparent that social and institutional collapse in Iraq were worse than feared, the Bush administration did not modify its policy significantly, and this made the CPA's job more difficult. Now, what lessons can Los Angeles take away in the case of strategic planning? I give the example of Measure H, the 50-member citizen planning group, which provided initial recommendations for the disbursement of Measure H funds. Now, as this was a temporary body, LA County leaders need to make sure that they're stepping in as a permanent integrated authority from which to combine plans across sectors and ensure the efficient distribution of funding. Moreover, planning for contingencies must be made in funding so that dollar amounts in funding are not set too hard in the budget, so that if issues are more extensive than feared, budget amounts may be adjusted. The second component I wish to discuss was organizational structure and staffing and its importance to the capacity building operation. Now, the CPA's precursor organization on the left was the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, or ORHA, and on the right you can see the organizational chart for the CPA itself. Now, I know this is a bit hard to see, but Basically, what you can see is that the CPA suffered from a lack of middle management, where the administrator, closer to the top, had 12 to 20 direct reports. And this led to an over-centralization of decision-making. Information often got lost, and it was difficult for the administrator of the CPA to hold individuals accountable. You can compare that to the organizational chart on the left, where the ORHA had a flatter organizational structure with more delegated, dispersed responsibilities and an appreciable level of middle management. Furthermore, a key component of staffing is the development of competitive career incentives. The CPA was never staffed above 56% in Iraq, mostly because of a lack of career incentives for the operation. For one, the occupation was very short term, so people did not think that it would impact their career options in the long term if they went to Iraq. And for another, work conditions were very arduous. CPA officials had to work in an obviously war-torn state in Iraq that was full of security issues. And because staffing was so low, CPA employees had to work 80-hour weeks. Now, what this means for Los Angeles is that competitive and significant career incentives should be provided to individuals who work directly with homeless individuals, such as public defenders, medical workers, mental health providers, drug abuse counselors, etc. I would give the example of Measure JJJ in LA City, which provided incentives for housing developers to build housing for the homeless. I believe a similar incentivizing logic should be applied for individuals who work directly with the homeless, as far as providing career incentives for those individuals to remain part of the capacity building process in the long term. The last component I wish to discuss is the importance of interagency communication, coordination, and feedback. And I believe this was the CPA's largest challenge. The CPA ultimately reported to then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who never established open and formal chains of communication from the CPA to other agencies in the administration. In fact, Rumsfeld didn't even allow CPA employees to contact their home agencies while in Baghdad. This led to a lack of information sharing that ultimately led to many controversial decisions from the CPA that would have benefited from greater interagency review. Further, a clear division of labor needs to be established among all agencies in the capacity building process. When a division of labor is not established and there is a multiplicity of stakeholders engaged in one operation, such as was the case in Iraq and such as is the case in homeless services provision, plans can often be duplicated or even run at cross purposes with one another. So in Los Angeles, what needs to happen is authorities need to provide a clear delineation of who has jurisdiction over homeless individuals when, what services must be provided, and what quantitative measures of performance can be used to hold individuals accountable. And when there is no clear division of labor like this, it is hard to know who the problem is and how to fix it. So my presentation has focused on the necessity of a cohesive and competent organizational structure to facilitate the capacity building operation. My case study clearly showed that the CPA did not have this kind of optimal structure. Now you will hear from my colleague Matt Park, who will demonstrate how a competent organizational structure assisted workforce development under the Affordable Care Act.
Thank you, Rex. So, my portion of the presentation will be discussing the improvements made to workforce developments after the signing of the Affordable Care Act and how the City of LA and LA County can learn from its efforts. The Affordable Care Act, Triple H, and Measure H legislation share similarities in the sense that both aim to bring care to a vast underserved population. For the ACA, the objective was to provide insured care for millions of citizens across the nation. As we all know, Measure H and HHH aim to serve one of the nation's largest homeless populations. To analogize the capabilities between both pieces of legislation, the sections of the Affordable Care Act that will be mentioned in this portion of the presentation include the reinforcement in graduate medical education, the services and capabilities provided by health centers, and the necessity for an overseeing workforce commission. First, I will discuss the need to increase graduate medical education to address a particular workforce shortage within homeless health care. Since the beginning of graduate medical education accreditation in the US, scholars have made it apparent that the benefits brought by GME programs are shared broadly by communities in every region and socioeconomic status. Effective at the start of July 2011 with a 5-year, $230 million program to expand primary care training, Obamacare looked to increase flexibility in laws and regulations that govern GME funding and promote training in outpatient settings. The healthcare law was also fashioned to redistribute excess residency slots to improve the delivery of care. Referring specifically to workforce needs within medical service provision in LA and LA County, homeless service providers can look to allocate capacity towards clinics, hospitals, and community health centers by sponsoring training and residency programs. Additionally, instead of having just one hospital or clinic sponsor the residency program, a community-based sponsor with multiple shareholders would be able to efficiently pull together their resources to accommodate the immense number of medical needs brought by LA's homeless population. While conflicting interests within these shareholders may be a challenge, successful collaboration between the shareholders would possibly lead to an efficient and cost-effective delivery of services. As mentioned by the Journal of Graduate Medical Education, there was a notable trend in training program graduates who tended to reside within the community of their teaching hospital/clinic after finishing the residency, which led to an increase in access and specialty services to vulnerable populations all throughout the country. This phase between residency to job security would be a great incentive for graduates seeking a career fresh out of medical school. To implement training regimens for homeless providers that acquire new hires, residency programs sponsored in LA and LA County can look at guidelines for homeless care to use as a backbone for their training programs. For example, the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council came up with the core competencies in the healthcare for the homeless setting, a guide which offers compassionate, client-centered preparation. And similar to the community outreach initiatives brought within graduate medical education, federally qualified health centers all throughout the country are at the forefront in bringing community-based care to underserved populations. After the Obama administration signed the Affordable Care Act, improvements in integration and efficiencies to care within federally qualified health centers were made and as a result expanded the insured population within the country. One federally qualified health center in Fresno, for example, created a whole new position for community development to conduct outreach and community events such as at schools and at health fairs. Similar outreach programs can be utilized for the vast homeless population in LA and LA County to locate and build provider-client relationships with those that need immediate health care. Through collaborations and partnerships, federal qualified health centers around the nation were able to provide services to the remaining needs of their expanded patient base. Collaborations and proposed partnership models have been devised by the National Association of Community Health Centers in a need to optimize resources and improve the quality of care. One such model that was proposed was the arrangement of purchase services. Through this model, two health centers or organizations can purchase services from each other and even provide compensation for services. In areas of service where capacity is lacking, this example of arranged services can be highly beneficial to fill in gaps of workforce. Service providers in LA and/or LA County can look to these federally qualified health center expansions as examples of efficiently providing the range of services necessary and to acquire the needed tools to provide to those who need immediate care. Finally, incorporating graduate medical education and partnership models into homeless care would obviously need the oversight to ensure the proper use of funding, the return of valuable data to lawmakers, and to stimulate policy innovation. Public Law 111-148 and -152 of the Affordable Care Act established the National Health Care Workforce Commission, but due to Congress not appropriating funds, the commission lies dormant to this day. From this lack of oversight, it is apparent that whenever a high influx of funding is allocated, a committee or a commission is necessary to oversee its proper configuration and distribution. A suggestion can be made for the characteristics of the committee. An independent committee that's solely focused on the needs of workforce and the homeless providers would, in my opinion, be the most fitting for Los Angeles and Los Angeles County. Also, it is important that the committee remain independent so the funding it oversees will not be diverted indiscriminately. In addition to having an overseeing commission, the integration of a data system similar to ones utilized by federally qualified health centers can be used for testing hypotheses and to get general insight on the status of the workforce. With a homeless population that fosters a multifaceted need for care, data systems can be of great assistance with calculating costs, case management, and assessing data needed for future demands in homeless care. And now, another set of strategies within capacity building will now be exemplified by Shernae's case study with the AmeriCorps Vista.
Thank you so much. So I'd really like for us to move a little bit away from strategy of structure and discuss the specific steps of what are required for capacity building in Los Angeles by looking at an organization whose job is capacity building, and they do it in a very efficient way, which is AmeriCorps Vista. AmeriCorps Vista is a federal program specifically working towards alleviating poverty in the United States. I think that this is an important case to highlight, specifically because Measure H is about allocating services to the homeless population, but the workforce that's required in order to distribute those sources need to be officiated in a way that's to scale of all of the funds that are coming in. So it's really important that you're choosing the right people to work with these vulnerable communities. I think that it gives insight to the importance of having a flatter organizational structure, as well as university partnerships and service corps and constant evaluation of the services that you're providing. So first and foremost, AmeriCorps Vista, which stands for Volunteers in Service to America, was started in 1964, so it has a very, very long history. It provides employees to nonprofit organizations, state and local government, as well as grassroots organizations. And it's also a one-year commitment. Now, the primary folks who are coming into AmeriCorps to be Corps members are usually millennials or folks who are retiring from the baby boomer generation. So you have two very interesting groups of individuals. People who are passionate, just now starting their careers and interested in learning how to get more hands-on experience, as well as the people who have skills that they've acquired through their careers, many, many years. And in both ways, they're bringing new things to the table. Excuse me. And it's also the organization that provides all of the infrastructure for AmeriCorps Vista is the Corporation for National and Community Service, also known as CNCS. CNCS was founded in 1993 by former President Clinton. It was founded as a corporation specifically to reduce bureaucratic inefficiencies and increase accountability to all the stakeholders, public, private, nonprofit, etc. So the structure of CNCS is very important to note, specifically because it's flat, and that's done very intentionally. There's a board of directors, as you can see, and a chief executive officer, and then the people who work directly in AmeriCorps Vista. Now, there is team members who work directly with the nonprofit or governmental agencies. It's usually about 8 to 10 people. And these are people who are highly trained in whatever particular services that they're working towards. And then they facilitate and work with the core members who, again, are primarily millennial or retired folks from the baby boomer generation. This is said to reduce the red tape and accountability to the communities they serve, because what they do is they frequently hold town hall meetings to assess the needs of the population and continually having evaluation of the services that they're providing, getting input, and then changing to best meet the needs of the community. Now, the specific training strategies of AmeriCorps Vista is important to note because they have an anti-poverty focus, but they also have a community empowerment focus, which again speaks to having their stakeholders consistently giving them feedback and reevaluating everything. But in their training of their members, they incorporate capacity building in a very interesting way, in that they are trying to teach everyone who comes in that they have a job to do. They structure it in such a way that they're able to meet the needs on a new scale. So something that happened in 2009 was the Serve America Act by former President Obama. and that allocated $1.14 billion to AmeriCorps and CNCS for an increase in employment. So they went from about 75,000 employees to 250,000 employees. And these were some of the strategies that they used to be able to expand in a very efficient way. Capacity building, again, is integral to their mission. So they mobilize over 900,000 volunteers annually and continually are leveraging the millions and millions of federal funds that they have to increase and better help nonprofits fulfill their missions. So some things that I felt were critically important in comparing the issues of Los Angeles homelessness and AmeriCorps Vista. I think that it's critically important to allow people who already have passions in social services to now be able to get hands-on experience in the field, specifically through pipelines or pathways to public service careers. So again, this is taking in people who are passionate, giving them the education that they need in order to be prepared to encounter these diverse populations. And then studies have shown that the alumni of AmeriCorps Vista in particular, a large majority of them ultimately end up going into public service careers, whether that is being a CEO of a nonprofit organization, working in legislation and policy to implement things and best practices for these communities, but also just committing to public service. Even if that's not their main career, they continually do public service throughout their careers. Excuse me. Secondly, it would be utilizing university partnerships, such as the one already at USC. I think it's important through the university partnerships and partnerships with the nonprofit organizations that they're working with to create a knowledgeable workforce. The thing about these communities and working with homelessness is that there's a myriad of reasons as to why someone may be in this particular situation. So it's so critically important to understand all of the intersectionality that comes at play when working with homelessness. So I think it's important to implement a pre-service educational program to ensure that participants know all of the socioeconomic status, socioeconomic factors and political factors that come into play. Additionally, it's important to have mandated, evaluations for all of the stakeholders to increase efficiency, not only because once you have lots of people who have their eyes on the work that you're doing, when you're letting everyone know, these are the funds that are coming in, this is how we're using it, you can kind of build bridges to establish trust throughout all the stakeholders. A lot of times, political efficiency is determined by whether or not the communities believe that their vote matters in how things are played out. So for example, the passing of these measures, although they had widespread support, these constituents are looking for how their dollars are now being spent. And through AmeriCorps Vista and them having consistent and constant reevaluations of the work that they're doing, giving that information to the public, and then revising their strategies consistently, it increased the trust, and then the constituents felt like their voices were being heard. So now we're going to defer to my colleague, Anna, who will be discussing the actual programs for how capacity building can work by looking at a case study similar to Los Angeles and that of New York.
Hello, thank you, Shernae. So like she said, my name is Anna, and my presentation will move from capacity building initiatives towards actual homeless programs and policies and how they may apply to LA. So my purpose is to highlight a few successes New York City has had with homeless policy in recent years, and so my presentation will have two main focuses. First are the preventative programs that have been put into place through de Blasio's 5-year plan, and second is the Robin Hood Foundation and their reliance on a metric system that they call Relentless Monetization. Ooh, sorry, it's me. And they use Relentless Monetization as a formula not to generate funds, but actually to figure out how to best allocate those funds. So just beginning with a few statistics from New York, on any given night in 2017, there are over 60,000 people sleeping in New York City shelters. Of those 60,000, over 15,000 were homeless families, with 22,000 children under the age of 18. Additionally, 58% of that population is African American, 26.6% are Latino, 10.8 are white, less than 1% are Asian American, and then there are 4% of an unknown race or ethnicity. Additionally, over 2% of the shelter population is 65 or older. 30% of the population suffers from a severe mental illness and or chronic substance abuse disorder. And finally, perhaps most staggeringly to me, 31% of the population are survivors of domestic violence. So some of these numbers are definitely comparable to LA. There are also almost 60,000 homeless people in LA County, and in terms of demographics, LA and New York are very, very similar. The most significant distinction, which we mentioned earlier, is that that LA has over 3/4 of its homeless population unsheltered, whereas in New York, of those 60,000 homeless individuals, only around 1,000 to 1,200 are unsheltered. A notable difference is that in New York City there's a right to shelter, which is now guaranteed by the state, and so we don't have that in LA. But beginning with some preventative programs, so the city covers 56% of the $900 million annual cost of providing shelter to homeless New Yorkers. So because of this, the de Blasio administration has invested massive amounts of money into preventative programs in order to ensure that more people are leaving shelters yearly than are entering them. So I think this is really relevant to New York, to LA, especially because Shernae mentioned the 23% increase in recent years, and I think preventative programs could be really, really useful. So first, beginning with legal services, the de Blasio administration invested over $100 million in legal services in 2017 alone. And additionally, the city will be phasing in $93 million over the next 5 years to provide universal access to free legal services for tenants facing eviction and other housing-related issues. So as a result of these programs, evictions dropped 23% between 2013 and 2017. And this is marking the second straight year that total residential evictions were under 23,000, lower than any time since 2006 at least, and you can see in this graph right here. Additionally, 40,000 people were able to stay in their homes in those 4 years, and eviction is actually no longer the leading cause of homelessness among families in New York City. So I think just as the way New York has had a lot of success in investing massive amounts of money into legal service programs, LA would have a similar amount of success. Additionally, we want to move on to the housing subsidy programs and the provision of emergency rental assistance. This has also enabled many more New Yorkers to remain stably housed. So programs such as Home Base, City FEPS, rent arrears grants for singles, adults, and families, and the Homeless Prevention Fund and others have been improved and have been increasingly successful in keeping people out of the shelter system. As a result of these programs, the city has provided emergency rental assistance to over 160,000 households at risk of losing their homes since 2013. So in this slide of the city rent subsidies between 2015 and 2017, 19% of those prevented entering the shelter system, and then 81% helped people exit the shelter system. Thought that was worth noting. So finally, I want to move on to the Robin Hood Foundation, which is New York City's largest poverty fighting organization. They develop and fund over 200 of the most effective schools, food pantries, homeless shelters, job training centers, health facilities, legal clinics, and more. What's most relevant for this project, however, is that Robin Hood brings in yearly funds of around $150 million. So much like LA, they have to figure out a system that would allow them to best allocate their massive funding. So in order to figure out which organizations are the best to fund and how to best allocate their funds, the Robin Hood Foundation has adopted a metric system, a form of venture philanthropy that they call Relentless Monetization. So by monetization, they refer to assigning dollar values to philanthropic outcomes. And by relentless, they mean making these assignments even when the benefits associated with those outcomes are hard to measure. So in this way, Relentless Monetization uses these monetized values, however uncertain, to guide philanthropists towards their best, most efficient outcomes. In other words, because they already have the funding, much like the way Los Angeles does now, they've figured out a system that determines how to allocate those funds most effectively. And 7 steps to find relentless monetization, I'll summarize without actually listing them, but first you want to adopt well-defined goals, of course, and then identify a specific intervention to analyze, identify each and every mission-relevant outcome that follows from that intervention, monetize, that is to say, assign a dollar value to each outcome, and then compare the benefit-cost ratios for any one proposal against another. So armed with these algorithms to reassign reasonable values to grants under review, No matter how different in form and purpose they might be, the funder can determine their relative impact per dollar using relentless monetization. So, like I said before, it constitutes a philanthropic strategy by which to pick the right proposals to fund, the right in the sense of generating the greatest expected benefit from the amount of money the funder makes available. And this metric system can literally be applied to any kind of organization and can definitely be applied to government organizations in LA that want to figure out how to best allocate the new funding they are facing. So I definitely think LA should try and adopt this method. It's been really, really successful for the Robin Hood Foundation. Also, as you can see on this last graph, is that Robin Hood places the greatest emphasis on educational programs. They fund over 51 educational programs in New York City, and 53% of those are K through 12 centered. So I really think that based on the success that Robin Hood has had with funding these educational programs and based on what the metric system allows them to sort of see the outcomes of each program, I think emphasizing education in a similar way they do in New York would be really helpful in LA as well. So now we've seen how New York City and their successes can apply to Los Angeles. And Maria, my colleague, will present the failures of San Francisco's homeless policy and the lessons that can be learned from that.
Hi, my name is Maria. I will be presenting on the failures of San Francisco. So I will be presenting San Francisco's initial effort to address this issue of homelessness and their failures, and then transition into their new 5-year plan and their initial strategy methods so that we could essentially apply them to Los Angeles. So a little background, the homelessness problem in San Francisco started in the 1970s after a decrease in mental health services post-Vietnam War. So a few statistics, there are 7,499 homeless persons in total, which means 795 homeless people per 100,000 residents. The gender breakdown follows as 33% female, 61% male, 5% transgender, 1% genderqueer, gender non-binary. Racial breakdown, 75% non-Hispanic or Latino, 22% Hispanic or Latino. And 77,486 people are chronically homeless. But I really want to highlight that 65% reported alcohol or substance abuse, 63% a psychiatric or emotional condition, 45 people reported PTSD, and there are over 3,000 people sheltered and over 4,000 people unsheltered. So I initially want to start with, the Care Not Cash program that Gavin Newsom sponsored in 2002, and this was an initiative to cut general system programs, and instead of giving homeless people a stipend on a monthly basis, they would reduce that stipend and provide services instead. But the problem was that over 66% of the homeless population did not receive general assistance. So that means that population and the population that included receiving other benefits such as veteran benefits would not be able to take advantage of this initiative. And the reasoning behind this is Gavin Newsom wanted to provide the services instead of the money so that the money wouldn't be used to buy drugs or alcohol. But the problem with this, so many people were excluded from the program, and then in turn they turned to crime to seek to seek food, to seek other, to seek drugs, alcohol. So they turned to crime. So my proposal for this is do not restrict capacity building efforts or benefits to any group of people, in this case families, because they were left out the most. Figure out how and who to best prioritize where the services are going into, and to never take the assistance they already have, even if they do refuse new ones, because we don't want them to leave them worse than they already started. And so then I want to move toward the 10-year plan. So in 2004, from 2004 to 2014, over a 10-year time span, San Francisco invested over $2 billion in homeless housing and services to reduce the number of chronically homeless people by providing permanent housing and other supportive housing programs. It did succeed in moving 19,000 people off the streets, but this is comparable to the Castro district, which is a really small district in San Francisco, but the keyword here is moving. And this is where I want to go into the Homeward Bound program. The Homeward Bound program is basically, they use funds to give them a one-way ticket to come together with family members across the nation, but they didn't fix the problem, they just moved it. And another failure was that there were only 74 shelter spaces for families, which resulted in a 6-month wait. And along the process, when I was conducting my research, it was very common for those forms to get lost in the process. And so then when the forms got lost, they would have to start all over again, and they were homeless for another year or whatever time that took to resolve that problem. And another problem was that there were 35 members of the committee that decided where all these funds were going to be allocated to. And another problem was, again, as my peers mentioned before, there is no structure. There's an overlap in information, and information can get lost along the way. So there was never any consensus in regarding what to do with this problem. And so when we move into the 5-year plan, their new effort is to reduce the city's chronically homeless population by 50% in December 2022 by tying 15 independent databases to track homeless people through housing, medical, and other services. Implement drug centers so they can go in for one assessment and all their medical history would be there. Open at least one new navigation center. But this would be hard to implement, and navigation center would be hard to pass in LA because the problem would arise that community members would not want one center for homeless people to come in and receive these services. So in turn, I propose that we can't, after all my research, I propose that we cannot simply move the program. We need to give them easy access to services and permanent housing. When we get the money to allocate it to services, we shouldn't move the problem. Before the funds are distributed, we should accurately plan who the money is going to and prioritize people without leaving anyone behind. Also, we should implement an integrated system to track use of homeless services, which is one common procedure for homeless applying for emergency shelter and other services. And we should establish ongoing care at medical shelters through the means of the DME program mentioned before, open medical shelters to provide nursing for homeless people that are recuperating. And so altogether, after all of our studies, we want to present our final policy proposal, which is as follows. A precursor to efficient capacity building is the development of an optimal organizational structure. Such a structure will facilitate unified strategic planning, attract competent staff via competitive career incentives, and facilitate inter-agency relationships and communication. We should also implement pre-service educational programs at partner universities and nonprofits, enforce mandatory evaluations to increase transparency and efficiency, and we should adopt a metric system just like the Robin Hood Foundation and use quantitative measures to aid the judicious allocation of resources to provide cost-effective strategy for capacity building. And finally, we should establish a digital integration of homeless data and services that will aid the development of unified mitigation strategies. Thank you.
Good job, team. I think it's pretty clear they all did a great deal of work. So now's our opportunity. You don't have to hide in the corner, guys. You can stretch out a little bit. They're not going to bite it, I promise. But now's our opportunity for our partners to have a chance to really have a conversation with you all and sort of tease out some of the nuances that we heard and any questions you have. So I'll defer to our partners for comments.
This is a great presentation. Should we all sit down? This feels a little...
We certainly could.
Yeah, that'd be great.
That'd be great. Why don't we sort of move our chairs in? Or maybe you guys can stay there and the students could grab some chairs and we'll make this like a book club, round table, whatever you want to call it.
I think that's Megan's.
Oh, sorry, Megan.
You sit in the middle.
Just right here.
We feel better now?
Yeah, we have 40 minutes.
All right, so who would like to jump in? Let me start. How about that?
Here, Matt.
While the partners get a chance to sort of get settled in. So what do you guys think? If there were a couple of specific takeaways from all the research that you've done that's specifically applicable to LA, what do you think those would look like? What does LA really need to do from a capacity building perspective to get this thing up and running so that it's not San Francisco, that it's parts of New York, but maybe not all of New York, or even from some of the other case studies we heard? What do you guys think?
Well, I guess a key component of any capacity building operation, like I mentioned, is division of labor. So Francis Fukuyama, in an article about the Iraq occupation, said that the administration should have actually codified via legislation a clear interagency division of labor for post-war occupations. And I believe a similar measure can be taken at the local level here in LA, where there is some kind of legislation or codification of the role of each stakeholder organization that's involved in homeless services. And in so doing, you could provide quantitative measures for performance so as to blame people when they're not doing their job or give people credit when they are.
What do you guys think? Does any of that resonate with you in terms of if you had to look in your crystal ball about what actually is going to happen in LA?
Crystal ball is kind of cloudy, I think, for all of us, which is why this has been such a challenging issue to address. I think, I think I was struck by a number of things. I actually thought the Iraq War was a really good example of this big influx of dollars. I mean, a totally different issue, to be sure, which highly politicized. It's war. I mean, there are some distinctions clearly, but I think that was one where they were walking around with bags of cash to give.
Yeah, wheelbarrows or whatever it was.
So whatever it was, but I think more to the point, it was on target in the sense of how did they strategize, how to deploy resources to do basic nation building. Didn't go well, obviously, but wondering, and sometimes things that fail on the surface doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad planning, given that it is in such a highly politicized context and a war was going on at the same time. So I'm wondering if there were any good thoughts about how to do this. I mean, you talked about what didn't work, failures. I think the interesting point there is, and it goes to the ACA issue that you brought up as well, in which it looked like they did contemplate some workforce development along medical. Clearly, ACA is a medical program.
Yeah.
So what we have here is in Measure H, basically legislation that's been approved, programs that have been developed, funds that have been allocated with no thought about capacity building, none that I know of. So here we are at this point in time. What do we do next? How do we catch up with what's been left out of that equation? I mean, I think there are some similarities given that this has also been a highly politicized issue. The voters voted for these dollars to flow. Everyone's waiting for it to happen. People want to see a change in this, the guy sleeping on the sidewalk down the street from their house. They want to see something happen immediately. And there was a lot of heat to get these measures out there and passed and defined. But I guess I'm feeling a little at a loss as to what the next steps are going to be, given what's already been decided. I mean, so what do we do now? And it's still an open question in my mind. I know that's a big. That was a lot of stuff I threw out there. But.
First of all, I was very impressed with the quality of every one of you, the work that you did, the way you coordinated it as a team. You brought it from start to finish in a very logical way from one person to another. And you brought out what I consider to be some suggestions or ideas that I don't think have really been, all of them, fully looked at or considered here in the Los Angeles area. So I did see a great deal of value in a lot of what you did. I particularly liked the way you framed the program at the beginning. It was accurate, exactly to the point, and the reasoning behind it. And then I thought it was fascinating to be able to take Iraq. I would have never thought of that. And I actually do think that there's some points that we need to consider for that, because in my experience sitting on the outside looking in, what I'm seeing is that the county is doing certain things and then the city is doing certain things. And in my opinion, they're not always clarifying who's doing what, and there's some duplication and there's some coordination, but a real clarifying of the responsibilities, because the city and the county are both working, and LASA is working within the city of LA, but then there's the whole region as well. So it's very complicated, and really fully identifying the roles in terms of who's responsible for what. I don't think that that's completely clarified at this point. So I felt like that was a really, really good point to make. And I also actually really liked the idea of comparing it to the ACA, because that was a huge undertaking, and programs had to develop a tremendous amount. And in fact, our workforce, in terms of the medical workforce, is not sufficient at this point. And in fact, one of the things that's happening at the USC School of Medicine are some planning to develop what they're calling a street medicine institute, which would be a way to train professional medical providers on homeless healthcare. And the resource that you identified, the manual that has some of the guidelines, I'm actually going to see, I've been working with the team that's working at LA County USC around how to train the residents who are working within the hospital, and they want to provide more curriculum for them in terms of how to work, because there are so many people who are homeless that go through that county hospital system, and they're not sufficiently connected to services, and they're not really working with them the way some people think needs to happen. So I'm going to just see whether they have been using that. To my knowledge, they have not. And there's an interest in doing that, so that feels like something of value. I also really like the concept of the AmeriCorps, and I wondered actually if you had thought anything about using the AmeriCorps concept for people with lived experience, because that's been an interest of mine to see how we could create. In some fields, people who have lived experience are considered very valuable portions of the service provision system, and we haven't really done that in terms of homelessness. We've done it in terms of substance abuse, HIV, even mental health. But I actually wondered about that as a mechanism whereby people could get some training, and they give a year of service, which then they can put on their resume, and for people who are building back a career that utilizes some of their own experience, it felt like that might even be something to consider. I've actually worked with the AmeriCorps program. I did that at an agency I worked with, and I really liked it. The thing that I found a little difficult was the fact that it was only a year commitment. And so there were only certain types of activities you could have. You couldn't make that your core workforce per se, but if you're going to try to incorporate people with lived experience and give them some career development, it feels like that could, a year's commitment there could be a realistic kind of approach with it. And then I was fascinated with the Robin Hood Foundation and the way that they were measuring it. I'm not sure. I know that HUD requires certain kinds of measurements, and right now there's a USC group that is helping LASA to develop, what are they calling it? Kind of just a real clear sheet that says, okay, here's the metrics we're going to measure, and we're going to put this out to the community in terms of how we're doing.
Right, yeah, I think there are a lot of companies that do similar.
But I've never seen,
But
they're
not
not
like
using anything like that at
Yeah.
all. It's very practical things. It's like how many people got housed, and then how many people went within a certain period of time, lost their housing, and you know, how long it took for them to get housed.
Mhm.
So they're very, very concrete measurements, but I'm really interested in that and would like to see them take a look at it.
Yeah.
So that will be something that I'll try to
Very cool.
share with that. And it's interesting to me what San Francisco did and how they, just from a political perspective, they were, the choices that they made, which I'm seeing a much more a broad-based approach here. And it's really interesting to see how when you only take a piece of it, what you end up doing is unintended consequences, and so crime goes up, and you see it wasn't effective.
And in the end, once they transitioned power, the Mayor Lee, he didn't place any emphasis on it. He just kind of let it go to the side. So there was no incentive for him, I guess, to, take care of this problem. So that's another issue.
So I have a question. Did, looking just at Measure H and the dollars that have been allocated for all the various programs, did you guys have a chance to actually figure out how many jobs would be needed to actually implement those programs that are funded? So what are we talking about? I mean, are we talking about 5 jobs or 500 jobs or 5,000?
As in numbers, we didn't exactly predict or determine how many jobs. We just determined through our staffing presentations how we would get that staffing or measures we would take to get those jobs, but we didn't come up with specific numbers.
And I think that might be very hard to predict anyway, because different agencies may staff it differently, or have different capacities, or the different approaches and different areas may require different kinds of staffing.
Brenda, which of any of these case studies would you say is the closest proximity to what we're going to see with H and HHH? Would it be New York? Would it be San Francisco, even though it really didn't work well?
I'd say it was the ACA.
The ACA?
The ACA
Yeah, I think so
had
too.
they passed it. In the legislation, they contemplated that they were going to have to do this training to get more folks into the profession, because we now have this program that is going to roll out. So to me, that was the closest one. But again, that's what's missing in Measure H. It's just the dollars.
So-
There's no thought about how this is actually going to roll out on the implementation level.
I was curious actually about that, because you mentioned that there was a plan for like an oversight group, was that? Could you say more about what you learned about how that was supposed to work and what it was going to do, what it was for?
It was mainly to use as a the committee was meant to reach back to Congress on what they found and what they are learning from the workforce throughout the nation. They're supposed to advise Congress on how to better implement their policy or allocate their funds. I think.
So sort of an independent body that would be looking at how workforce was being trained and deployed and where the gaps were, and then be able to represent that back to Congress to help change policies or address the problems that they saw.
Yeah, just over the general status on the healthcare workforce around the nation. But I think coming from the 2008 housing crisis, there were some budget constraints that restricted a lot of the funds that were supposed to go to that commission.
Was this? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no,
I just had a question. Was the oversight body a newly created body, or was it going to be built into this? I mean, whenever Congress allocates 10 cents, it has some level of oversight to keep our politicians busy, I guess.
It was.
Was it going to be its own independent, newly created body just to do oversight on the ACA?
Yeah, the Workforce Development Implementation part of the Affordable Care Act said they were going to establish the committee by July 2010, but and never, or there were supposed to be appointments for the committee, but it never went through.
Is there any thought, I would assume there's got to be some oversight with H and HHH, there has to be.
There is, both H and HHH have citizen oversight commissions, groups. It's interesting, though, that I think after ACA was passed, then the composition of Congress changed, so it's not at all surprising that the funding didn't follow the legislation.
Yeah, which is kind of why I proposed for an independent body to not face any discrimination with the allocation of funding.
Yeah, so they starved it. I mean, if you can't kill a program, you just starve it.
Right.
By unallocating dollars.
It's a really interesting idea, though, to think about having LA County, as part of the Homeless Initiative, identify and set up a separate group that's just focused on monitoring, identifying the quantity of workforce that's needed, and monitoring the kinds of opportunities that are available and where the gaps are that need to be focused on more of it, who could take a bigger picture look at it.
Yeah.
So that would be an interesting idea. I was also actually interested in the point from Iraq where there was a group that didn't have any ties to what the other groups were doing.
Yes.
And
So-
there's some work in here where it's built in because public health and the health department
Yeah.
is linked in pretty closely. But I'm wondering if there's other areas and agencies that should be linked in that haven't been.
Yeah, well, I think addressing homelessness is obviously a multifaceted process. So agencies that would need to be linked in with each other, in my mind, would include all types of healthcare, which includes mental health services and drug abuse treatment. The court system and the criminal justice system obviously need to be integrated as well. And affordable housing providers. I would say those are the three main sectors I can think of. And how you do that is actually reaching out across agencies and establishing formal channels of communication and just letting people talk to each other. That was the big failure of Secretary Rumsfeld's administration of the CPA, was that he wouldn't let CPA employees talk to their home agencies while they were in Iraq. He was just kind of a control freak. That was the main reason.
So it's just his personality quirk, huh?
Yeah.
Ellie,
Yeah, and I definitely know least about this issue from anyone in the room. So, pardon me if this is a sort of basic question, but one of the things that struck me was the commentary about prevention, right? How do you prevent these people from getting on the street in the first place? And I'm wondering, in these funds that were given, so much of it was to build housing, which is not necessarily prevention per se. And the services, the funds for services, are they allowed to be allocated towards preventive measures?
So there are some
So there's
prevention
no-
strategies, there are some very specific prevention strategies, and there's some investment in the legal services around eviction. I don't know if there's enough.
And is there a set amount that
Yeah,
they're
there
saying
is.
this much can go to prevention?
Yes.
So would you recommend increasing the funds for prevention versus the funds for more reactive measures?
I mean, I would just based on, like Shernae said, there's been a 23% increase only in the, did you say last year?
Yes.
So just that alone
There
would
were
be enough.
a little over 20,000 newly homeless in 1 year.
Right, so that's incredible. So I think for any of that's enough to say, yes, I think funding should be increased. But I think also legal services, but just rental assistance of any kind has seen so much success in New York, keeping people out of homeless shelters, helping them leave homeless shelters. So yeah, I would think that there should be an increase in preventative programs.
And is that something that's even feasible, or is what's set?
Done. There. I believe that there is a fairly significant emphasis at this point with the latest strategies toward prevention, and I know they're doing it through, the county has these, especially for families, they have these family resource centers, and then the city has family source centers. And through both of those, there's both counseling around eviction and legal services, and there's a pretty active identification of people who need some actual subsidy kinds of things.
One of the challenges they found with rapid rehousing was the fact that there was a sort of a stipend that was available for a limited period of time. presumption was, and the target population for that was folks who could generate their own income. If for some reason lost their job or didn't have enough money to pay their rent, they would get some supplemental support for a finite period of time. I don't remember how long it was, 6 months or 9 months. And then it would end, the presumption would that person would get their job or another job, and then they pay the rent. But that doesn't quite work for homeless folks. Typically, folks who have disabling conditions of one part or another are not going to be able to pay the rent in the marketplace, which is high, and in limited supply. And so I think that's all of
Right,
these,
well, that's
all
why
of these
the-
things, are defined by the lack of housing and the cost of housing. And it affects all of these strategies. And so, you can put more money into rental subsidies, but if the housing stock is insufficient, it's not going to help. And so I think they carved out certain, it's always a question, how much do we put in this bucket versus that bucket? And we're trying to hit all the targets. It's always a question of where do we put the emphasis? There is some money, obviously, for prevention, but do you take it out of the housing pot or the services pot? Where do you take it from to increase what's allocated? So it's always a tough one.
There's a lot of money allocated for that rapid rehousing, but for a lot of that, that is for people who are homeless, who have circumstantial kinds of situations. And as Mike said, one of the things that I had heard was happening is that people would get their housing subsidies and they would get help to actually locate a place, bless you, and get into it. And then the idea was they were supposed to generate their own income and be able to take over the leases that had been established for them. And a lot of them were really not able to do that. In the time frame that was established, it was like a 6-month time frame, and that was really fast. And these families were trying to deal with kids and all these other issues in terms of trying to get everything so they'd get into a place, but they weren't necessarily ready to be able to go into the job market and get employment to the degree that they would be able to take over the leases within the time frame. So there's been some extensions on that, and I don't know ultimately how successful that's going to be. But I'm curious if you got any feedback from New York if when they did that kind of approach to get people housed, because they use rental subsidies as well. Was there a time frame that
Actually, I think they were unconditional. Like, that was the point of a lot of the programs, is that like no matter what your circumstances were, they were going to help you with your rent until you didn't need it anymore. So it wasn't based on getting a job or being sober or it was I think they've taken now an unconditional approach, because before they had a lot of conditions placed by Mayor Bloomberg and Mayor Giuliani, and those were just really detrimental, obviously.
So I wonder if you had a chance to look at what the Funders Collaborative does here in Los Angeles.
I did not.
Because it's pretty robust. It's actually United Way's the lead agency, with a lot of support from Hilton Foundation, as well as other philanthropic groups, California Policy Foundation, but a lot of smaller ones as well that some years ago organized something called Home for Good, which was a plan to really pressure the city and the county to coordinate their activities in a better way. The money previously had been very fragmented in terms of the way it was deployed. And so, to their credit, they were able to get the city and the county to sign on to a much better strategy on how best to use existing resources, but also to bring new resources in. They raised money, actually at Homeward, which used to be here in the neighborhood. And then it's now been moved to downtown. It was a fundraising effort, and those dollars were then deployed out to community organizations for various kinds of services programs. But it's quite the model. It's United Way's lead agency, again, with a lot of support from Hilton and other philanthropic groups. And they have their own set of metrics as well. So Is this really over, or they have more stuff they can do? Is this the finish line?
It's over.
It's over, okay. Wow.
I will say this, though.
I will say that that is a good point. The Funders Collaborative, I've been participating on that now for a while since I started. And it really is a historic effort where all of the major foundations in the Los Angeles area came together with a unified vision and objective so that they all put their money in, or good portions of money into the strategies around homelessness. And since they're not a governmental funding organization where a lot of the structures required, they are much more nimble, and they focused on trying to do some enhancements of the service to provide funding for things that weren't able to be funded, to kind of fill the gap. So they took initiative initially around the CES, which is the coordinated entry system for matching people, and they really focused on that. The latest round of funding, they were looking at strengthening a bunch of things within the system that people were identifying around capacity building that they didn't have access to in other ways. So I want them, we're gonna have a film on this, right?
Yes.
Okay, because I want them to take a look at it. I want them to hear the ideas and look at how some of them kind of echo what they're already doing, as well as if it might give them some interesting ideas about future.
Well, the other thing I will say is, each one of them has done a 10-page policy paper on this that actually has more information than we even heard today. And so you'll be getting all of that when they come in on Monday at 12 o'clock, which I know they'll be busily working on all weekend.
A fun weekend.
Exactly. But unfortunately, our hour is up, and I get the sense we could talk about this for a long time.
Interesting.